Thomas had always moved through Ashford as though the town were a narrow corridor carved for him alone, a place of predictable rhythms and worn edges. It was a small market town pressed between low, damp hills, its streets curling around each other in a quiet knot. The buildings carried the muted shades of weathered stone and fading paint, a palette that made the place feel older than it really was. He liked the stillness of its mornings, the way the bakery smell seeped into the mist that rose from the river, the faint echo of shoes on cobblestones when the streets were mostly empty. There was a kind of solace in knowing that tomorrow would look much the same as today, and that the faces around him, neighbors, shopkeepers, the same pensioners leaning against the war memorial, would repeat themselves with the same regularity. It was on such a morning that the rhythm cracked. He had left his narrow terrace house a little later than usual, coat collar turned against the drizzle, and stepped onto High Street with the half-distracted intention of picking up groceries. He was not expecting anything beyond the gray persistence of the town. Yet when he lifted his gaze across the square, his body went taut before his mind could explain why. There, standing at the far end near the old iron fountain, was a man whose posture, build, and very presence arrested him in an uncanny way. For a moment, Thomas thought he was glimpsing a reflection in glass. The man had his shoulders the same slight forward stoop as though bracing against cold, the same long arms hanging with awkward stillness. Even from a distance, Thomas felt he was studying himself, not in a playful or flattering way, but in a jarring replication stripped of context. The coat was almost identical, dark wool falling to mid-thigh, and the hair, thick, brown, with a tendency to curl at the ends when damp, was the same. He froze mid-step, aware of the wet chill settling on his face. The street seemed suddenly too quiet, though he knew faintly that a van was unloading crates outside the grocer and a couple walked briskly under umbrellas. His eyes remained locked on the figure by the fountain. The man was still watching, or perhaps not watching. Thomas could not be certain, because the distance made detail indistinct. But he felt it, that invisible thread, the sensation of being studied. A thought stirred in him, fragile and unwanted. Had he been seen like this before by someone else? Could a neighbor or passerby have mistaken the man for him already? He tried to dismiss it, to imagine coincidence. The town was small, wardrobes limited, men of similar height not uncommon. Yet the deeper he examined the silhouette, the harder it became to file the encounter under chance. There was something deliberate about the stillness of the figure, the way he occupied the space without motion, as though he had been waiting for Thomas to turn that corner. He forced himself to walk on, pretending to browse the flower stall, though the blooms were bedraggled by rain. He risked another glance across the square. The man had not moved. A surge of unease ran through him, prickling along his arms beneath the coat. He shook it away, or tried to. When he finally reached the grocer and busied himself with apples, bread, a tin of soup, he told himself it would be foolish to look again. But he did, peering through the window glass as he paid. The space beside the fountain was empty. Relief came sharp, almost painful, followed by a hollowness he could not name. He carried his bag home in silence, avoiding the gaze of others, and once inside he left the groceries untouched on the table. The house seemed different, heavier, though nothing had changed. The narrow hall, the coat rack, the faint smell of damp from the cellar. He stood there listening to the faint ticking of the clock. It would have been easy to let the incident dissolve into the blur of memory, a trick of resemblance soon forgotten. Yet it clung to him. In the evenings, he found himself pausing by the upstairs window, scanning the street lamp glow for the silhouette. He noticed how often he caught reflections of himself in shop glass, and each time his heart lurched before recognition settled. It was as though the town had developed a subtle hostility, not overt, but something sharpened at the edges. 3 things in particular lodged in his mind, though he tried not to dwell on them. First, on the very morning he had seen the figure, the clock in the market square had stalled at 7:42 and remained there until late afternoon. No one he asked seemed to know why, though the mechanism was usually reliable. Second, that same day he discovered a faint smudge on his own coat pocket, a pale streak of chalk or dust he could not recall making. And third, when he set his groceries down on the table, he found the loaf of bread already sliced, though he had been certain he had picked up an unsliced one. Each detail on its own was trivial, explainable, but together they formed a constellation of disquiet he could not map. Days passed. He went to work at the council office, typed letters, filed forms, and nodded to colleagues whose lives touched his only at the edges. He returned home to his silent rooms, heated soup, and listened to the pipes clank. Yet the image of the man by the fountain shadowed each routine. He began to sense him in peripheral moments, a figure across the street or at the bend in an alley. When he turned his head fully, there was no one or only a stranger who bore no resemblance at all. Still, the sensation persisted, a pulse beneath the skin of daily life. The town itself seemed to lean closer. The air felt heavier, carrying a faint tang of iron that he could not ascribe to weather alone. The buildings, once comfortably drab, looked as if their windows watched him, black squares with patient attention. Even the river seemed slower, its surface reluctant to break into ripples. Thomas thought often of leaving, but the thought collapsed beneath the weight of inertia. His job, his rented house, his groceries waiting on shelves, these anchored him. Yet every evening when he walked home across the square, his eyes sought the fountain. Sometimes he imagined he saw the outline again, a shadow blurred by distance or mist, only to find it dissolve into ordinary passers-by. One night he woke abruptly, the silence of the house pressing against his ears. He felt he had been pulled from sleep by something outside, a faint shuffle or scrape. He lay rigid, listening, breath shallow. Nothing came, only the occasional drip from the gutter. At last he rose and went to the window. The street below was empty, but the lamplight seemed too bright, exposing the pavement in a way that felt merciless. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw someone standing at the corner, but the form wavered and melted into shadow. The next morning, he told himself it had been dream residue. He dressed with careful slowness, buttoning his coat as though armor. On the way to work, he passed the fountain again. A new notice had been pinned to the railings. The water would be drained for cleaning. He studied the dark iron basin, its streaks of lichen, the way it collected rain. It looked older, emptier, as if it had already surrendered something. And then he saw it, a faint reflection on the wet stone rim, the curve of a face that mirrored his own. He stepped back sharply, heart pounding. When he looked again, it was gone. For the rest of the day, Numbers and letters blurred before his eyes. The figure, the resemblance, the persistent sensation of being doubled, these circled in his thoughts with patient inevitability. He began to wonder if the town itself was conspiring, bending its ordinary surfaces into copies of him, erasing boundaries between the self he knew and something other. That evening, as he closed the office and walked into the dimming streets, he felt the certainty settle, quiet and heavy. He was no longer alone in Ashford. Whether the man was flesh or shadow, stranger or twin, Thomas could not yet say. But he knew, with a clarity that chilled him, that their paths would meet again, and that the town's narrow corridors had already narrowed further, guiding him toward a place he could not yet see. And as he turned the corner into his own street, the air tightened, carrying the faint impression of footsteps that matched his own, perfectly timed, just behind him, though the pavement appeared utterly bare. The next morning, Thomas walked with deliberate calm, trying to shape his body into something ordinary. He rehearsed the rhythm of his steps, the slight swing of his arms, the way his eyes should move from storefront to sky. But every gesture seemed heightened, as though he were not only performing them for himself. He felt the weight of another presence nested inside the town, a second current running beneath the visible one. At the edge of the square he paused. The fountain was dry now, its basin crusted with green stains. Children's chalk drawings spread across the stones nearby, crude suns and animals already softened by drizzle. He told himself he would look once, prove the absence, and keep walking. The figure was there. Not at the fountain this time, but against the wall of the post office, half in shadow. Same coat, same slouched shoulders, same tilt of head. Thomas stopped short, his breath catching. A woman passed him with her dog and glanced curiously, but he remained fixed, staring across the square. The man raised his hand in a slow, ambiguous gesture. Not a greeting, not a warning, merely an acknowledgement of existence. The air between them tightened, a thread drawn taut. Thomas felt his knees weaken. He turned sharply down the side street, his ears filling with the roar of his own pulse. He walked fast, unsure where he was going. The narrow lane smelled of damp brick and fried food from the takeaway at the corner. When he reached the end, he forced himself to stop, press a palm against the wall, and breathe. He risked a glance back. The square was empty. By the time he reached the office, his shirt clung with sweat beneath his coat. He forced a smile at Margaret, the receptionist, who commented that he looked pale. He muttered something about the weather. At his desk, papers blurred in front of him. His pen left crooked trails. Every sound in the room, the cough of a colleague, the shuffle of files, struck with exaggerated force. He could not shake the imprint of that hand raised without expression. At lunch, he considered calling Daniel, an old friend who lived one town over, someone who might listen without judgment. But the thought of explaining it out loud made his throat close. Doppelgangers were for folk tales and nervous breakdowns, not for council clerks who filed permit requests. He folded his phone back into his pocket and sat alone with his sandwich, chewing without taste. The afternoon dragged. When at last he escaped the office, he decided not to go straight home. Instead, he wandered along the river path, its air damp and metallic. The water moved sluggishly, reflecting the dull orange of street lamps. He thought he was alone until he heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly. A jogger passed, nodding with breathless courtesy and continued on. Thomas let out a ragged laugh that startled even him. He followed the river until it bent toward the railway, then circled back into town. At the corner near his house, he froze. Across the street, under the halo of a lamp, stood the man again, not moving, waiting. This time, Thomas's fear cracked into anger. He strode across the pavement, his voice bursting hoarse from his chest. He demanded to know who he was, what he wanted, why he followed. The words echoed harsh against stone. The man did not respond. He simply turned, walked calmly down the adjoining street, and melted into darkness. Thomas stopped chasing after only a few steps. He realized his fists were clenched, his chest heaving. A curtain twitched in a nearby window. He hurried inside his own house, bolting the door behind him. That night, sleep came jagged. He dreamed of mirrors with cloudy surfaces, of reflections that stepped forward uninvited. He woke at 3 with his throat dry and the taste of metal on his tongue. The next day, he forced himself back into routine. Work, files, nods, polite exchanges. He managed until late afternoon, when Margaret tapped his desk and said someone had asked for him in the lobby. He frowned, puzzled. Visitors were rare. When he stepped into the reception area, no one waited. Margaret looked up from her desk, surprised. She swore the man had been there only a moment ago. Tall, dark coat. Said he knew Thomas. Thomas's stomach turned. He muttered thanks, retreated quickly, and spent the remainder of the day unable to focus. After work, he caught Margaret before she left. He asked her to describe the man again. She gave a quizzical smile, teasing that perhaps he had a twin. Same hair, same build, same nervous air. She chuckled, expecting him to join, but he could not. That evening, he finally called Daniel. His friend listened, at first amused, then increasingly sober as Thomas's voice faltered. Daniel asked if he had been sleeping, if work was stressful, if he had spoken to anyone else about it. Thomas insisted it was not exhaustion. He described the raised hand, the stillness, the uncanny precision. Daniel's tone softened. Maybe it was a prank. Someone who looked like him and enjoyed the reaction. Maybe a stranger had mistaken him for someone else. Thomas said he wished it felt like that. Instead, it felt rehearsed, intentional, as if each encounter had been placed carefully in his path. They spoke for an hour. When he hung up, Thomas felt both lighter and more exposed. Naming the figure aloud gave it solidity. The following week blurred into a sequence of encounters, each one more deliberate than the last. Sometimes Thomas saw him across the street during his commute, sometimes at the grocer's, once reflected in the glass of the bus shelter as if standing directly behind him. Always the same stillness, the same unbroken gaze. One rainy evening, Thomas ducked into a pub, desperate for the buffer of strangers. The room smelled of beer and fried onions, the low hum of voices pressing close. He ordered a pint and sat near the wall, trying to melt into the chatter. A woman at the next table caught his eye. She was perhaps in her 30s, sharp-featured, wearing a green scarf damp from rain. She smiled faintly, then asked if he minded her sitting closer, since the place was crowded. He nodded, grateful for company. Her name was Claire. She worked at the library, lived near the station. Their conversation began awkward, then steadied. She noticed his distracted glances toward the window and asked what he was looking for. He hesitated, then confessed haltingly that he kept seeing someone who resembled him too closely. She tilted her head with interest rather than skepticism. She said she had seen him before, meaning Thomas, but perhaps it had been the other man. She described a moment outside the library, a figure in a dark coat, head bent, who had passed her without recognition, though she had been sure it was him. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. He asked when this had been. She thought last Thursday, around closing time. Their conversation deepened. He found himself telling her details he had not told Daniel, like the bread that changed shape, the clock that stalled, the sensation of footsteps. Claire listened intently, her gaze steady. When the pub began to empty, she offered to walk with him part of the way home. The rain had slowed to drizzle. Their footsteps echoed softly. At his corner, she paused, her expression unreadable. She told him to take care of himself. As she walked away, he felt both comforted and unnerved. Someone else had seen the figure. It was no longer only his perception. That night, he lay awake, the street lamp glow slicing his room. He thought of Claire's calm eyes, the way she had not dismissed him. He wondered if he should see her again, confide more, test reality against another witness. But beneath that fragile hope lay a deeper dread. If others saw the figure too, then its existence was indisputable. And if it was indisputable, then what did it want? The rain had ceased by dawn, leaving the streets rinsed and pale, their stones glimmering with a thin film of water that caught the first hints of light. Thomas stood at his window, shoulders pressed to the frame, watching the world edge toward clarity. The night behind him had stretched long and raw, filled with restless pacing and the echo of that final sight. The figure's wave, the deliberate turn toward his house, the certainty that the long dance of doubling was nearly over. His body carried the residue of that moment, every nerve poised for intrusion, every shadow on the street suspect. Yet the silence remained intact. No knock came at the door, no silhouette darkened the threshold. The house breathed its own still, damp air, faint with the smell of yesterday's extinguished fire. He brewed tea with trembling hands, the simple ritual anchoring him. The kettle's whistle rose thin, filling the small kitchen. He held the mug warm against his palms, but his eyes drifted back to the window. Across the street, a neighbor emerged with her bins, her slippers slapping the wet ground. She moved without alarm, without recognition of any haunting. Thomas envied her calm. By late morning, he knew he could not stay inside. He slipped into his coat, pulled the collar high, and stepped onto the slick pavement. The air smelled of wet iron and fresh earth, the kind of scent that followed a storm. The square was nearly empty, only a handful of early shoppers drifting between stalls. The fountain, still drained, sat like a hollowed relic. He half expected to see the man there again, the familiar stance waiting. But the space was bare. A voice cut through his scanning. Claire's, firm yet softened by relief. She was standing by the grocer's, a bag of books slung over her arm. He felt his chest loosen. She walked toward him quickly, her scarf bright against the washed-out morning. When she reached him, she placed a hand lightly on his sleeve, grounding him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said. He let out a strained laugh. "Perhaps I have." Her gaze searched his face, then it softened. "Come, walk with me. I don't think either of us should be alone today." They moved together through the market. She spoke of ordinary things at first, the library's leaking roof, the stubborn photocopier, details that threaded normalcy through the raw air. He listened, letting the cadence of her voice ease the tightness inside him. But as they reached the quieter lane near the church, He found the words pressing forward. "He came to the house last night," Thomas said. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the damp air. Claire stopped, turning to him fully. "You saw him there?" He smiled. He waved. Then he walked toward me as if he belonged. Her hand tightened on the strap of her bag. "And did he enter?" Thomas shook his head. "No, not yet. But I felt something final, as though the waiting is ending." They stood in the hush of the lane, the church bells distant. She lifted her eyes to his. "Then you must decide how it ends." You cannot only watch the weight of her words settle deep. For so long he had been passive, the one observed, the one shadowed. To imagine choosing action felt like breaking a pact with fear itself. Yet, as he met her steady gaze, he knew she was right. The hours that followed unfolded with an odd stillness. He accompanied her to the library, its tall windows streaked with rain. The scent of paper and dust filled the air, comforting in its constancy. She found him a seat by the radiator while she shelved returns. He watched her move between aisles, each motion precise, and felt a fragile tether form. In the late afternoon, she brought him tea in a chipped mug reserved for staff. He cradled it, the steam rising against his face. "You've been living in his shadow," she said quietly. "But what if the shadow cannot stand the light?" He nodded slowly. The thought took root. When dusk drew near, he knew he had to return home, though the prospect made his stomach knot. Claire insisted on walking him part way, and he did not resist. Their steps echoed softly through streets growing darker, lamps flickering awake one by one. At his corner she stopped, her eyes catching the glow. "Promise me something," she said. "What is it?" "Don't run?" "Not any more." He swallowed, then agreed. She touched his arm once more, then left him at the corner. The street to his house yawned quiet, only the faint hum of distant traffic. He walked slowly, every sense sharpened. When he reached his door, he paused, half expecting to see the figure waiting beneath the lamp. The pavement was bare. Inside, the house welcomed with familiar silence. He closed the door gently, leaned against it, and breathed. The rooms carried their usual scents: wood, old plaster, the faint tang of dust. He moved through them as if seeing them anew, aware of their fragile safety. He lit a lamp in the sitting room, its glow softening corners. He sat with his hands folded, waiting. Time stretched, shadows shifted on the walls. He felt sleep pressing but held himself upright. And then, near midnight, the floorboards creaked. He rose slowly. The sound came again from the hall. His heart pounded, but he remembered Claire's words, "Don't run." He stepped into the hall. The air was thick, as if holding its breath, and there, by the door, stood the figure. The resemblance was absolute, every line, every gesture. Yet the eyes, when Thomas forced himself to meet them, carried no reflection, only a still hunger. He spoke, his voice rough. "Why are you here?" The figure tilted its head, silent. Thomas took another step forward, his own breath clouding the air between them. "You can't have this life." "It is mine." The figure's mouth curved, almost a smile. Something steadied in Thomas. He reached for the lamp on the hall table, lifted it high, and let its glow flood the narrow space. The figure did not retreat, but in the stark light its edges wavered, less certain, as though the brightness thinned it. Thomas held the lamp closer. "You're only what I allow." The figure's gaze flickered, the first crack in its composure. For a long moment they stood, locked, mirror and man. Then, slowly, the figure lowered its raised hand. The same gesture as before, now emptied of power. It turned, opened the door without sound, and stepped into the night. Thomas followed to the threshold. The street was empty. The air smelled of rain and new leaves. He stood there until the cold pressed into him, then closed the door. In the days that followed, he felt the absence like a bruise, tender but healing. He looked for the figure out of habit, but the corners of streets remained unclaimed, the fountain only stone and water. Each morning he woke with the disbelief of survival, then the gradual settling of peace. Claire visited often. They shared quiet meals, long walks by the river, where the water now moved brisker, as though relieved of weight. She teased him gently back into laughter, coaxed stories from him that had nothing to do with shadows. One evening, as they sat with tea in the soft lamplight, she said, "Do you feel lighter?" He considered, then nodded. "Yeah, not untouched, but lighter." She smiled, her scarf draped loosely on the chair. "That is enough for now." Spring edged into the town, buds pushing through soil, the days lengthening. Thomas began to dream not of mirrors, but of open fields, horizons unbroken. He carried the memory of the figure with a strange tenderness, as though it had been both enemy and teacher. Yet one thread remained, unresolved. Sometimes, walking home at dusk, he thought he heard an echo of his own footsteps, a faint rhythm just behind. When he turned, the street lay empty, the air still. He would pause, listen, then continue, allowing the mystery to trail him like a shadow that no longer ruled. On a bright morning in May, he stood once more by the fountain, now filled again, water arcing clear into the basin. Children tossed coins, their laughter scattering across the square. Thomas leaned against the railing, the sun warming his face. He closed his eyes and felt the simple truth of presence, the weight of his own body, the pulse steady in his wrists, the breath filling and emptying. He opened his eyes to the brightness of the day, and for the first time in many months, he did not look for anyone else.